It's 60 AD. The combined forces of the tribes of Britain, under Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, are finally meeting their Roman oppressors, led by the governor of Britain, Suetonius Paulinus. The Roman legions are vastly outnumbered, by as many as 20 to 1, by the seething mass of Celts that have the gods and justice on their side. The following battle will change the course of history, as either the island of Britain will be freed from the invaders, or the Roman Empire will rule Britannia for centuries to come. The woman known to history as Boudica, Celtic warrior queen of the Iceni tribe, was born in the modern-day county of Norfolk, in the southeast of England, sometime between 25 to 30 AD. Although information about Boudica's lineage is scant, and the identity of her parents is widely debated, many historians agree that Boudica was of royal descent, and had 2 daughters, who were princesses of the Iceni, whose names are unknown. Their father being Boudica's husband, Praxitegus, who she married in around 49 AD. Ruling as a nominally independent ally of Rome, Praxitegus, unlike some Celtic kings, had managed to retain his throne after the invasion of Britain, ordered by the Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, attaining Roman citizenship and even governorship of the Iceni region, largely by paying tribute to Rome and maintaining good relations with them. Cassius Dio, a Roman statesman and historian, in his writings called A Roman History, describes Boudica as tall, with tawny or red hair hanging down to below her waist, a harsh voice and a piercing glare, whilst it is said she also wore a large golden torque or necklace around her neck, as well as earrings and bracelets, a colourful tunic and a thick cloak fastened by a brooch. But despite her status, she would also reportedly take off her jewellery on occasion and work the fields with the common people. As well as this, Dio went on to say that Boudica was a pagan druid priestess who used methods of ancient Celtic divination, as she was said to have, on one occasion, released a hair from the folds of her dress and was able to predict in which direction it would run, whilst it is also said of her that she invoked Andraste, the British goddess of victory, during her campaign against Rome. Whilst some have ultimately questioned the very existence of Boudica, the resurrection of her fame in Britain is in part down to Queen Victoria, who celebrated the warrior queen's defence of Britain during the 19th century, and even supported the construction of the famous statue of Boudica and her daughters that now stands in London near the Houses of Parliament, whilst perhaps coincidentally, the name Boudica is thought to be derived from Boudicca, meaning she who brings victory, and is even thought to be the origin of the name Victoria. Boudica's tribe, the Iceni themselves, were an Iron Age people, centred in the English region of East Anglia, their capital being Venta Icenorum, near modern-day Caister St Edmunds, just south of Norwich. However, their territory stretched throughout the county of Norfolk and into parts of the county of Suffolk, and it is also said by some that Boudica had a palace in the vicinity of the town of Thetford. The people of the Iceni, like many Celts of the time, wore animal skins for clothing and carried spears, short swords and daggers during battle, and it is thought that the name Iceni itself was first used by Roman historians, although it is also suggested from the writings of Julius Caesar that Sene Magni was the original name ascribed to the Iceni tribe, which means Great Iceni, although some academics have suggested that the Sene Magni were a distinct or separate tribe altogether. It is thought that within the Celtic tribes, both men and women were farmers of crops and cattle, whilst archaeological evidence shows that Iron Age Celtic tribes also worked with tin, iron and timber, and lived in large homes known as roundhouses, made of clay and straw, with a central chimney opening at the apex of the roof, and a door that always faced towards the rising sun. The Iceni territory itself was bordered to the south by the Trinovantes, who occupied South Suffolk, as well as the majority of modern-day Essex, whilst to the west lay the territories of the Catavaloni tribe, whose territory consisted of much of central eastern England. The Iceni were traditionally thought to have spoken a Britannic or P-Celtic language, related to that of Celtic Welsh, which was the main language spoken in pre-Roman times of British history, and records from this period also suggest that there was a high degree of trading and communication taking place between Britain and the continent, the Celtic tribes being influenced by French Gallic migration, as documented by Roman annalist Tacitus. It is also known that the Iceni were adept at metalwork, possibly trading Celtic-style techniques with the peoples of Gaul and Phoenicia, with such tribes as the Veneti, which is evident in the discovery of Iceni relics and treasure troves. For example, archaeological finds such as the impressive Sehamtoni and Snetisham treasure hoards found in West Norfolk and northwest Suffolk, which included finds from mainland Europe. These discoveries also reveal the true extent of the craftsmanship of the Iceni, as well as their technological skills, and it is thought that the reason for these large hoards of treasure being deposited in the first place was that the Celts may have buried their jewellery and other valuables for safety, possibly for future purchases or bribes, which were then forgotten about or lost when their owners died unexpectedly. Evidence for this Celtic excellence in metalworking is also demonstrated by the fact that the Iceni were minting coins as early as the turn of the 1st century from gold and other precious metals, often depicting animals such as dogs or wolves, with a bird resting on the back of the animal, and as well as this, other coins such as silver currency displayed human faces in the Roman style, while the reverse side was stamped with horses, with smaller currency coins containing boars to the front and horses on the back. Furthermore, the Iceni were adept at hand-to-hand warfare, as they painted their bodies in blue woad, a dye derived from a yellow flower that was common in East Anglia at the time, and many Celts typically chose to fight naked rather than wear armour, as clothing and armour would restrict movement during face-to-face combat. But although this approach was thought by the Iceni to demonstrate great courage, and was indeed intimidating, their valour would ultimately meet its match with the arrival of Tiberius Claudius Caesar's Roman legions, protected as they were by advanced segmented armour and helmets. Rome's initial conquest of Britain had first begun in the year 55 BC, under Gaius Julius Caesar, which, although largely unsuccessful, marked the start of diplomatic ties between the various Celtic tribes inhabiting southern Britain and Rome itself. Nonetheless, any plans to secure Britain entirely were halted after Caesar's murder in the Roman Senate in 44 BC, which culminated in civil war that was eventually won by Caesar's nephew, Octavian, who made himself Rome's first emperor, Augustus, in 27 BC. The context of Julius Caesar's planned invasion was not only one of militaristic expansion and exploitation of economic potential, but was also used to secure his political position as Rome's greatest general and statesman, who was willing and able to wipe out any threat to Rome's expansionist plans, meaning that essentially defeating the Celtic tribes of Europe was as much about personal political maneuvering as it was territory or riches. In order to facilitate, or rather manipulate, favourable public opinion within Rome, Caesar used propaganda tactics to paint the Britons as a race of primitive barbarians who were a threat to Roman civilization. And following Caesar's conquering of much of Gaul in modern-day France, he sent scout ships across the English Channel in 55 BC to gather intelligence on the best methods of attack, whilst the pleas for peace from the tribes of Britain were ignored. This culminated in Caesar's famous attempted invasions of Britain, first in 55 BC with 2 legions, or 10,000 men, and again in 54 BC with a 5-legion, 27,000-man force, and during his time in Britain, as part of his Gallic Wars, Caesar's exploits brought him into conflict with Cassivellaunus, who is thought to have been the leader of the Cativellauni, who had overthrown the king of the Trinovantes and sent his son Mandubratius into exile. Despite this infighting in the face of the Roman invasion, the Celtic tribes appointed Cassivellaunus as leader of their combined forces, and he led a combined army of Britons using guerrilla tactics and local knowledge to slow the advance of Rome's legions by preventing the Romans foraging for food. After this, the two forces met at the only fordable crossing point of the Thames, and the Romans managed to cross despite the sharpened stake defences that the Cativellauni had employed. It was then that the Cativellauni resorted back to their guerrilla tactics, using local knowledge and the speed of their chariots to deter the Romans. After this, Other tribes named by Caesar as the Senimagni, the Ancilites, the Segontiaci, the Bibroci, and the Cassi sued for peace and revealed the location of Cassivellaunus's position to Caesar, which resulted in a siege of his stronghold. Cassivellaunus then managed to get a message to 4 of the kings of Kent, who sent reinforcements to take the Roman positions on the coast, but they were unsuccessful in doing so. And once he found out that one of the chieftains, Lugotorix, had been captured and his forces routed, Cassivellaunus surrendered, but was allowed to keep his throne if he paid homage to Caesar, and pledged to remain at peace with the Trinovantes, whose deposed king, Mandubratius, was restored by Caesar. Caesar's exploits also saw him engage in numerous conflicts with other tribes during this time, and he was victorious in many battles, subduing a number of the Celtic leaders, whilst forging relationships with tribes, such as the Trinovantes, which is an example of the divide and rule strategy that would be deployed by the Romans in Britain during their numerous invasions. It was at this point, however, that Caesar left Britain before the onset of winter of 54 BC because of a massive insurrection in Gaul due to failed harvests, meaning that Rome's plans for subjugating Britannia were ultimately unsuccessful and had to be shelved for another 97 years. The imperial subjugation of Britain wasn't a priority for Rome at this time, as economically, the revenue they could raise from customs duties on goods would be more valuable to them than maintaining an army on the island to rule over the disparate tribes. But despite this, with the onset of the Julian-Claudian dynasty, several missions to Britain were attempted once more, but aborted due to other priorities taking precedence within the Roman Empire, as well as terms being agreed with the Britons prior to the missions taking place. Examples of the aborted campaigns include those led by both Augustus in 34, 27 and 25 BC, and much later by Caligula in 40 AD, who was responding to reports that Rome's allies, the Trinovantes, had been subjugated by the Cativelloni, who had captured their territory, including their capital of Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester in Essex. However, the infamous emperor did not actually engage with the tribes, instead opting to send a scouting mission, bringing back conchi, or seashells, leading the emperor to claim, on his return, that he had subdued Neptune himself. It wasn't until the reign of Emperor Tiberius Claudius that the Celts of southern Britain would finally be subdued, almost a century after Caesar's attempts, when in the year 43 AD, a full-scale invasion led by Aulus Plautius conquered and integrated the Celtic tribes around southern England, before the Roman Empire began to expand further into the Welsh territories and to the north of the island. The Emperor Claudius was initially thought of as a weak and feeble character in Rome who could be easily manipulated, which is why he inherited the Roman emperorship following the assassination of his nephew Caligula in 41 AD by the emperor's elite Praetorian Guard, as he was a tyrannical and paranoid leader that misused his power and was likely deluded, whilst Claudius, although sane, was not thought of as a natural leader or as being fit for public duty by other Roman aristocrats. Nevertheless, Claudius was selected by the Praetorian Guard, who intended to install a puppet emperor after slaying his nephew Caligula, and according to Roman historian Suetonius, despite Claudius being uncharismatic and suffering from physical issues, his disadvantages did not deter him from legitimizing his position by emulating Caesar's attempt to invade Britain, that would ultimately result in Rome holding sway over the island for the next 400 years. Claudius's expansion into southern Britain was complete by 47 AD, and had incorporated the region now known as southern England into the Roman Empire for the first time. Nonetheless, Britain was not thought of as important from a militaristic perspective, but instead, the invasion was largely about politics in Rome itself, as the conquering of Britain meant both the Praetorian Guard and the emperor himself were viewed favourably. On invading Britain in 43 AD, Claudius appointed Aulus Plautius to lead Rome's armies, alongside future Emperor Vespasian, who commanded the 2nd Legion Augusta, who were backed up by the 9th Legion Hispana, the 14th Legion Gemina, and the 20th Legion Valeria Victrix, along with thousands of auxiliary troops, totaling around 40,000 men, that set sail from modern-day Boulogne in Gaul in 43 AD, crossed the Channel, and headed for Richborough in Kent. Before entering into further battles, the Roman legions waited with Aulus Plautius for the Emperor Claudius to arrive, who joined his forces for the offensive on the major Celtic stronghold of Camulodunum, which had previously been held by the Trinovantes, but was now controlled by the Cativaloni under their king, Paulinus, father of both the deceased Togodumnus and the exiled Caraticus. It is said that Claudius arrived at Camulodunum with a number of war elephants. That would have surely been a spectacle to behold, and it wasn't long before the city fell without further resistance and surrendered to Rome. The physical presence of Claudius, acting to legitimize his position as Roman Emperor and as the conqueror of Britannia, although he only stayed on the island for 16 days before leaving for the continent once more. But nonetheless, he would later accept the title Britannicus, bestowed on him by the grateful Senate in recognition of his conquest. However, Claudius insisted that he would only accept the title if it were borne by his son instead of himself. The Cativaloni's defeat was a major success for Rome, because they, as the strongest of the southern tribes, had been instrumental in protecting the Celtic way of life in Britain for nearly a century against their imperial aggressors, and it was during this time that many Celtic leaders switched allegiance to Rome, including Cogidubnus, who was established by Claudius as king and legate of the Roman Empire in Britain, ruling from Noviomagus Reginorum, which is modern-day Chichester in West Sussex. An inevitable consequence of the Romans invading Britain was that legions would be required to garrison the island, meaning that Camulodunum, or Colchester, was made the temporary garrison headquarters of the 20th Legion Valeria Victrix. But after the legions marched westward in 49 AD, the defences were dismantled, and Camulodunum was renamed Colonia Victricensis, the provincial capital of Britannia, in which its native citizens had equal rights to the citizens of Rome. After this, Colonia Victricensis became a town for military veterans, with the barracks being converted into housing and a temple being built in or around 50 AD that was dedicated to Claudius on his death 4 years later, the foundations of which can still be seen to this day, as much of the temple was later incorporated into Colchester's Norman castle, which was largely constructed from recycled Roman building materials. The Roman foundations of Colchester Castle are said to be the earliest substantial Roman stone structure visible in Britain today, and it is an ever-present reminder of the Romans' influence, and later, after Boudica's revolt and sacking of Camulodunum, substantial outer walls were constructed to defend it, along with a monumental arch located at the western gate of the town, made of tufa, a variety of limestone, and Purbeck marble. Indeed, Camulodunum, which was first mentioned on Celtic coinage between 20 to 10 BC, is thought by many to be Britain's oldest recorded town. Therefore, it is of no surprise that the Romans chose the settlement to be one of their main military bases, as the significance of repurposing Celtic fortifications as Roman outposts cannot have been lost on the local tribes, whilst this, as well as the recently established merchant and commercial town of Londinium, modern-day London, on the northern bank of the River Thames, acted as the two main centres of Roman power as well as commerce in southern Britannia. Following the taking of Camulodunum, the Roman legions spread out across Britain on a number of incursions, including the capture of the Isle of Wight, led by Vespasian, and the Second Legion Augusta, whereas the Roman historian Suetonius states that Lindum, present-day Lincoln, was sacked by the 9th Legion Hispana, whilst the 14th Legion Gemina descended on the Midlands, eventually defeating the fugitive Caraticus in Wales in 50 or 51 AD, securing Roman dominion over southern Britain, after which Caraticus sought shelter with the Brigantes. In 47 AD, the commander of the invasion of Britain, Aulus Plautius, returned to Rome and received the highest award given by Roman senators, that being an ovation. Whilst in Britain, he was replaced by Publius Ostorius Scapula, who carried out an invasion in Wales against the Ordovices and continued to subdue the already oppressed tribes in England by disarming them, causing already rising tensions to escalate further as Celtic traditions and ways of life were oppressed. Scapula then put down uprisings by both the Brigantes and the Iceni in 47 AD, after which he banned weaponry from the British tribes altogether and returned to his objective in Wales, where he fought against the Silures, but he died soon afterwards in 52 AD and was replaced by Didius Gallus, who would reign as governor of Britain for another 5 years. According to some sources, during this time, Caratacus had taken refuge amongst the Silures, but soon afterwards, the fugitive warlord was captured in Brigantia in 51 AD, after seeking refuge with Queen Cartimandua, leader of the Brigantes, who, no doubt seeking Rome's favour, handed him over to the invaders and was subsequently rewarded with great wealth. Caratacus was then taken to Rome as a prisoner after 8 years of unsuccessful conflict with the legions. However, Claudius would ultimately be merciful to his former enemy and allow him to end his days in Rome, when upon being sentenced to death, the former warlord gave an eloquent and courageous speech, stating that, "Does it really follow that everyone should accept your slavery? If I were now being handed over as one who had surrendered immediately, neither my fortune nor your glory would have achieved brilliance." The subjugation of Wales then continued under governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, who in 60 to 61 AD embarked on his now infamous invasion of the sacred Isle of Anglesey, which was the spiritual centre of the pagan Druids, who in many ways were the collective religious leaders of the Celtic peoples, practiced in law, medicine, politics, as well as religion. But despite their importance, their class, although literate, were forbidden to take records. Therefore, little evidence exists concerning them, but it is certain that the Romans saw these mythical people as a major threat to their stranglehold over Britain. Anglesey, or the Isle of Mona as it was known at the time, was a refuge not only for Druids, but also for displaced tribespeople who wanted to avoid the ravages of the Roman invasion. But once the legions reached Mona, the Romans, under Paulinus, killed the Druids en masse and destroyed their ancient sacred woodland groves in what is now known as the Menai Massacre, that doubtless was meant to crush the will of the Celtic people, but in reality caused outrage and hatred amongst the island's tribes, who were now, due to Rome's harsh rule, on the brink of a full-scale revolt. Although the Romans brought their own customs and way of life, such as the rule of law, courts, roads, trade, and better sanitation, other introductions, such as heavy taxation and the treatment of the oppressed Celts, were not welcomed by many, and although Roman influence was embraced by some, it ultimately resulted in rebellion, one of which was devastating, and, this time, it was led by the Iceni. During this period, relations between the Romans and the Iceni had remained cordial on the whole, but tense, as the tribe lived in relative peace, with no garrisons within the confines of their territory, so long as they surrendered their arms. But regardless, the Iceni people were still seen by the Romans as second-class citizens, who were often exploited, pillaged, raped, and even murdered, which only fueled the flames of resentment and hatred. To add to these insults, the Iceni had to pay for their freedom with coinage and satisfy other demands, such as the provision of agricultural goods, essentially paying for their uneasy independence from the invader. And although the Iceni had fiercely resisted Rome's expansion into their territory initially, in 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius reached an agreement with Boudica's husband, the Iceni king Prasutagus, for homage to be paid to Rome, which he agreed to in a desperate attempt to preserve his own culture and position. This agreement made both Prasutagus and Boudica extremely wealthy, but the Romans' naivety or disregard of the Iceni way of life and Celtic culture in general perhaps inevitably caused animosity, and it is unclear from Tacitus's writing whether Boudica's husband Prasutagus surrendered to a Roman advance, or whether he was placed in a leadership role following the Iceni rebellion of 47 AD against the Roman governor Scapula's banning of weaponry. But it is clear that an agreement was reached in which the Iceni people could live in relative peace if Prasutagus, on his death, gave up half of his lands to Rome, whilst the other half was to be retained by his 2 daughters with Boudica. This tenuous relationship was placed under severe strain by the Emperor Nero, who had a very different outlook on Britannia to his predecessor Claudius, as he wanted to increase Roman influence on the island to ultimately collect more wealth via taxation, and it was then that Catus Decianus, a Roman procurator, or law official, under Paulinus, made the decision to plunder the Iceni's lands in order to recoup payments for the massive loans which Roman officials, such as Seneca the Younger and Paulinus, had given the Iceni in the preceding years, and subsequently, upon the death of Boudica's husband, Prasutagus, in 59 or 60 AD, Roman troops laid siege to the settlements of the Iceni tribe and confiscated their lands and property altogether. Despite the negotiations undertaken by Claudius and Prasutagus concerning the Iceni inheritance plan, the Romans now chose to ignore the agreement, which stated that his daughters should inherit his land and titles, as the invaders would not accept that a woman could inherit or indeed rule, and furthermore Boudica also felt that she had been sidelined by Prasutagus in his plan for the Iceni succession, which combined with the Roman annexation of the Iceni lands, no doubt tipped her over the proverbial edge. It is unclear as to whether Boudica was made leader of the Iceni immediately after her husband's death, or instead in the aftermath of the Roman attacks, as it may have been the case that her being proclaimed the queen of the Iceni made her the target of the Roman army, as after the death of Prasutagus in 60 AD, she was, according to Tacitus, stripped and flogged publicly, possibly with a cat o' nine tails, tearing the skin from her back, while she was then forced to watch as her two daughters, aged 10 and 12, were repeatedly raped in front of her, which was an act that was supposed to break the spirit of the Iceni and their queen. However, seeing her suffering, Boudica's people tended to her wounds, as well as her daughters, after the Romans had left. Following this devastating attack, all Iceni property was confiscated by the Romans, and the kingdom was annexed into the empire, whilst in addition, Seneca the Younger continued to demand repayment of the large sums of money he had loaned to the Iceni, and used severe means to make sure the debts were repaid, meaning that much of the Iceni aristocracy was sent into servitude in Italy. That prompted the remaining Celtic leaders in the east of England to band together and begin planning a full-scale insurrection against their Roman overlords. To rally support, Boudica is said to have travelled through neighbouring territories in her war chariot, reportedly invoking the divine power of the Druids to inspire the uprising against the hated Romans by calling upon the Celtic goddess of victory, Andraste, to rally the population, as, after all, she was reportedly a Druid priestess herself, meaning that before long, tens of thousands of Celts were flocking to her banner, including the remnants of the Trinovantes and the Catavalorni tribes, who cast aside their differences to join the Iceni rebellion, and they all fought in the name of Celtic liberty with Boudica to rid Britain of the Romans once and for all. According to Tacitus, Boudica amassed a following of up to 70,000 people, while Cassius Dio states her horde was a staggering 120,000 strong. However, modern historians think that the true number may be lower, but what is certain is that a sizable proportion of the Celtic population of southeast England, if not a majority, rose up against their Roman oppressors, as many of them had been preparing and waiting for many years to reclaim their homes and possessions, or merely take revenge. Tacitus records that after rallying the scattered tribes, Boudica addressed her armies with these words: "It is not as a woman descended from noble ancestry, but as one of the people, that I am avenging lost freedom, my scourged body, the outraged chastity of my daughters. This is a woman's resolve. As for men, they may live and be slaves." It was then, with this mighty seething host of irate Celts at her back, that Boudica turned her attention to the focal point of Roman power in southeast England, the provincial capital of Camalodunum, which now lay undefended and ripe for the picking. Whilst Camalodunum had previously been the capital for the Trinovantes for a time, as well as the Catavalorni, it had been taken over by the Romans and used as a retirement community for discharged older Roman soldiers, which caused further local resentment, as did Rome's Statue of Victory, which honoured their conquering of the region. At the time of the Iceni revolt, Suetonius Paulinus was still campaigning in Wales, with 2 legions, having concluded his annihilation of the Druids on Anglesey, whilst another legion had been stationed in modern-day Exeter to the southwest, and another, the closest, the 9th Hispana, was stationed in Lindum, modern-day Lincoln, meaning that the entire southeast of the province of Britannia now lay undefended. After approaching Camalodunum from the northwest, Boudica's army swept down through modern-day Norfolk and Suffolk, eventually linking up with her Trinavante allies and approaching Camalodunum from the northwest, entering the city through the modern-day Balkan Gate, possibly with the aid of spies within the city, after which the Celts embarked on an orgy of violence and destruction, burning the entire city to the ground and massacring the Roman population, as well as toppling Rome's Statue of Victory that had been predicted by the tribal soothsayers. On Boudica's charge, Camalodunum was laid waste, with up to 50,000 warriors attacking in one sweeping assault, followed by a siege and the subsequent storming of the Temple of Claudius, where many of the town's inhabitants had sought refuge, that Tacitus later described as a citadel of eternal slavery from a Celtic perspective, who, after surrounding the temple after several days, burned it to the ground. And despite the veteran Roman soldiers donning their armour once again to protect Camalodunum, after 2 days, the town fell, with the civilians inside the Great Temple being burned alive. And to this day, a thick layer of ash is often found across Colchester whenever archaeological excavations are permitted. During the sacking of Camalodunum, the Celts were also able to thwart Roman efforts to reinforce the beleaguered town, as the 9th Legion Hispana, under Petilius Carialis, was ambushed en route from Lindum, with Celtic charioteers and foot soldiers attacking the Romans from both sides, and, unable to see off the Celts, Hispana lost all of their infantry in the ensuing rout. Whilst back in Camalodunum, Boudica's army decapitated the bronze statue of Nero that had been erected outside the temple of Claudius, and kept his head as a souvenir of their victory. Despite their evident effectiveness at guerrilla warfare and lightning raids, Boudica's warriors, unlike the Romans, were less well equipped for open battle, but the Celts' use of their maneuverable war chariots, along with their knowledge of the land and forests, granted them victory. And as Boudica had destroyed a Roman legion, as well as the provincial capital in a matter of days, both she and her army, no doubt bolstered with a newly found sense of confidence, naturally turned her eye to the commercial centre of Roman Britain, Londinium. Having now received word of the sacking of Camalodunum and the decimation of the 9th Hispana, Paulinus left his legions in Wales and sped down the main road between the Roman city of Chester and London, Watling Street, to assess the readiness of the city's defences. But after arriving and realising he did not have enough men to contain the Celts, he decided to sacrifice the town for the sake of the province, by returning northward and rallying the remaining legions in the hope of bringing about a decisive future battle with Boudica. Tacitus reports that the Britons, upon arriving in Londinium, were vicious in victory, as they took no prisoners, instead preferring to slaughter and burn all they encountered. Indeed, Dio states that the noblest women were impaled on spikes and had their breasts cut off and sewn to their mouths, to the accompaniment of sacrifices, banquets, and wanton behaviour in sacred places. Indeed, recent archaeological excavations reveal a thick red layer of burnt debris, including coins and pottery, dating before AD 60, within the Roman-built walls of Roman London, whilst Roman-era skulls found in Walbrook in 2013 are thought to have been victims of the rebels. After sacking London, Boudica and her army turned to the north, in the hope of finding and defeating the remaining legions under Paulinus, and after leaving Londinium, also sacked the town of Verulamium, present-day St. Albans, where the Celts massacred the people and burned the buildings without mercy, before continuing onwards to the northwest along Watling Street. Whilst the Celts were ransacking Verulamium, Paulinus was planning to confront Boudica on his own terms, and according to Tacitus, amassed a force of some 10,000 men from his own legion, the 14th Gemina, along with the 20th Valeria Victrix and some auxiliaries. However, the 2nd Legion Augusta of Poenius Posthumus remained in Exeter, and so had failed to link up with Paulinus, and so he would now, after the loss of the 9th Hispana, have to take on a force of perhaps 200,000 Celts, with only 10,000 men. And so Boudica marched north to confront Paulinus, who now, joined by his 2 legions, chose a defensive position along Watling Street and waited. The exact location at which the 2 armies met in 60 AD is still argued over by current-day academics, but accounts suggest the most likely battle sites along Watling Street include Manduacidum by current-day Manchester, close to Atherstone in Warwickshire, or Lactodorum, modern-day Towcester, whilst other suggested sites include a high cross at the junction of Watling Street with the Fosse Way, the Rampart in Messing near Colchester in Essex, as well as Amesbury Banks in Epping Forest. Another possible site at the Cuttle Mill area of Paulsbury in Northamptonshire not only matches the topographical description of the site given by Tacitus, but was also the site of an excavation which uncovered large quantities of human remains, including bones from both sexes, including children, as well as fragments of Roman pottery from the 1st century. Nonetheless, it is likely the exact site of the battle will never be known, although most historians agree the battle took place somewhere along Watling Street, between St. Albans and the junction with Fosse Way. Having rallied his troops, Paulinus took a stand at a position of his choosing with a wood to his rear, although Cassius Dio states that his numbers, if lined up one man deep, would not have stretched the full length of Boudica's front line. So instead, Paulinus' legionaries formed a marching wedge formation, 8 men deep, with cavalry placed on the flanks, whilst each wedge of soldiers in the formation took turns in fighting, before swapping with fresh legionaries, stabbing with their Hispana short swords, also known as a gladius, through the gaps in the shield formation into the exposed flesh of their adversaries. According to Cassius Dio, having sighted the Romans, Boudica, on a war chariot, followed by cavalry and supported by infantry, formed up opposite the Romans, after which she addressed her troops from her chariot, accompanied by her daughters, depicting herself not as a wealthy queen fighting to regain her lost riches, but as a woman and mother, avenging the abuse of her daughter's chastity and her own lost freedom and humiliation at the hands of the Roman invaders, stating, "You can follow me or submit to the Roman yoke. Let us therefore go against them, trusting boldly to good fortune. Let us show them that they are hares and foxes, trying to rule over dogs and wolves. We shall fight and be victorious, or die trying." It could be argued that although the Roman legionaries were the best troops on earth at this time, Paulinus and his men were the underdogs in the upcoming battle. As if he had failed, both he and his men would be massacred, in turn meaning that Rome's stranglehold over Britain would have been greatly weakened. But although his army was heavily outnumbered, Paulinus had chosen his position carefully, as he placed his legions at the top of a gentle slope, with his flanks covered both by his cavalry and the surrounding forest, meaning that the Celts, if they wanted battle, had to approach his men head-on and en masse, which was exactly what he wanted, as his legions were expert in defending a position against a larger, undisciplined barbarian force such as Boudica's. It was then that the Celts charged the Romans, perhaps as many as 200,000 of them running towards the legions, screaming as they went. But when the Celts approached the Romans, thousands of them were felled in seconds by 2 javelin volleys, whilst those behind them, after running over the bodies of their brethren, crashed headlong into the Roman shield wall, where they were greeted by the tips of their enemies' swords. Nonetheless, as the fighting raged on, it soon dawned on the Celts their huge advantage in numbers was now a handicap, as their warriors in the front line were being pushed forward by the mass of people behind them, making it difficult for them to use their longswords, so that when the Romans in turn began to advance in their wedge formation, the Celts were mown down like grass and trampled underfoot, until before long, Boudica's army routed from the field, but were trapped by their own baggage train, from which their families were watching the battle, and so tens of thousands of Celts, including women and children, were slaughtered by the Roman cavalry, which charged in from the flanks and delivered the coup de grace. According to Tacitus, only 800 Romans were killed or injured during the Battle of Watling Street, during which he claimed some 80,000 Britons were killed. However, Boudica is said to have fled the field during the rout, but her ultimate fate is uncertain, as Tacitus states in his annals that in 60 or 61 AD, Boudica committed suicide by drinking poison, whereas Agricola, writing 20 years before the annals, mentions nothing about this, and puts the end of this period of revolt down to laziness or disinterest, whilst Cassius Dio says that Boudica fell ill following the quashed revolt, died, and was given a lavish burial. During her revolt, Boudica ultimately failed to field an army capable of winning a pitched battle against the Roman legions, which was the key to her downfall, as despite being greatly outnumbered, the Romans were well armoured, more disciplined, and better drilled than the Celts, which combined with their brutally effective battle tactics, such as the wedge formation, enabled them on numerous occasions, during Rome's many military campaigns, to defeat larger, disorganised barbarian armies. In hindsight, it could be said that if Boudica had maintained her hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, she may have prevailed, and in time may have forced the Romans to retreat to the continent. But instead, the highly organised Roman military once again proved itself to be perhaps the most effective killing machine of the ancient world, which, after all, is one of the main reasons the Roman Empire came to exist and dominate modern-day Europe and beyond. In the years that followed, the Romans continued their fight against the Celtic tribes of southern England, and were ultimately successful in quelling the Britons, and in the immediate aftermath, any land and property owned by the Iceni was either seized or destroyed. Although further conflict between the Celtic tribes themselves still continued, when Paulinus was recalled to Rome several years later, the majority of modern-day England and Wales was fully under Roman control, and this position would continue for another 350 years, in which the hitherto Celtic populations were assimilated into the Roman way of life. the evidence for which, both physical and cultural, can still be seen across Britain, and indeed mainland Europe. Despite failing to defeat the Romans, Boudica has achieved near-legendary status in Britain today, as her fight for freedom, self-preservation, self-governance, and an independent Celtic identity resonated with her people at the time, and still does today, as many see her as the very epitome of a freedom fighter, whereas others regard her as one of history's first female role models who dared to challenge the most powerful empire in the world, and almost won. Indeed, the drama and significance of Boudica's life was perhaps best put to paper by the 18th century English poet William Cowper. When the British warrior queen, bleeding from the Roman rods, saw with an indignant mien counsel of her country's gods. Sage beneath the spreading oak sat the Druid chief, every burning word he spoke full of rage and full of grief. Rome for empire far renowned tramples on 1,000 states. Soon her pride shall kiss the ground as the Gauls are at her gates. What do you think of Boudica, queen of the Iceni? Was she a murderous, barbaric and vengeful mystic, with little knowledge of battle tactics or strategy? Or was she one of history's greatest female leaders, who bravely led her people against the most powerful empire in the world, and in doing so proved that even the might of Rome could be challenged by a brave and fearless woman? Let us know what you think in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.